tonight, and some weapons win battles. Others bend the imagination so completely that even centuries later we are still trying to decide what was real and what was fear made visible. Greek fire belongs to that second kind of story. You are standing in the mind's quiet theater on the deck of a Byzantine ship at night. The sea is black glass, broken only by the soft hiss of foam along the hull. Oars dip and rise like the breathing of some patient animal beneath you. A lamp burns inside a hooded lantern, its flame trembling in the wind, throwing brief gold across wet wood and bronze fittings. Somewhere ahead, beyond the darkness, another fleet moves, an enemy fleet, its silhouettes barely distinct from the horizon. You hear creaking rope, the faint clatter of metal, a distant voice swallowed by salt air, and then, without warning, the darkness blooms, not with a clean, ordinary flame, but with something that behaves like a living substance. A roaring tongue of fire leaps from the bow, arcing forward in a bright, violent stream. It strikes the enemy ship and clings. It spreads, it spits and crackles. Water splashes up, yet the fire does not die. If anything, it seems to feed on panic, on movement, on the frantic rush of men who cannot understand why the sea itself has become useless. This is how Greek fire lives in the historical memory, not merely as an incendiary, but as a paradox, a flame that refuses the world's simple rules, a weapon that burns on water, a secret that outlasts the hands that made it. And beneath the mystery, there is a gentler, deeper story, one about survival through silence. Because Greek fire was not only a formula, it was a state decision, a guarded tradition, an entire culture of controlled knowledge. It was the Byzantine Empire turning secrecy into strength and turning the sea into a wall. To understand Greek fire, you have to begin in the world that needed it. The Byzantine Empire, what we often call the Eastern Roman Empire, was a civilization that carried old Rome forward into a new era. It was administrative and ceremonial, theological and practical, surrounded by rivals, inherited by emperors who were expected to be both generals and guardians. It was a world of marble forums and incense-dark churches, of legal codes and tax registers, of diplomacy as subtle as embroidery and violence as sudden as a storm. By the 7th century, that world had begun to narrow. The old map was shrinking. War and plague and political upheaval had already weakened the Mediterranean's familiar rhythms. Then the Arab conquests erupted outward with astonishing speed, reshaping the eastern provinces and pushing toward the Byzantine heartlands. Cities that had been Roman for centuries shifted into new hands. Borders that once felt stable became lines of anxiety. For Constantinople, the capital, the threat was not abstract. The city was the hinge of continents, a fortress and a marketplace, a spiritual center and a treasury. It sat where Europe and Asia almost touch a place where ships and armies could be delayed, diverted, or destroyed. Its land walls, the famous Theodosian walls, were a masterpiece of late Roman engineering, layered stone towers, ditches, and gates designed not to be rushed. But even the greatest walls have a vulnerable side, because Constantinople faced the sea. To the north and east ran the Bosporus, a narrow strait with strong currents and mercurial winds. To the south lay the Sea of Marmara, opening toward the Aegean and the wider Mediterranean, and curling into the city like a protective arm was the Golden Horn, a sheltered harbor so valuable that chains could be stretched across its mouth to deny entry. The capital's defense was not only masonry, it was also ships, it was also control of water. And that is where Greek fire appears at the edge of necessity, where the empire's survival depended on denying an enemy's fleet the ability to close into blockade, to starve the city into submission. Yet Greek fire arrives to us through a veil. No Byzantine source simply hands over the recipe, neat and confident. No surviving imperial manual gives the full method in the way a modern chemist would demand. Instead, what we have are descriptions, sometimes vivid, sometimes vague, scattered across chronicles, military treatises, and later retellings. We have names and dates that are plausible, but not perfectly secure. We have stories told by those who feared the weapon, admired it, or wanted to magnify the empire's cleverness. Tradition often credits the invention to Callinicus of Heliopolis, an engineer who fled the turmoil of the eastern provinces during the Arab advance, bringing knowledge and invention with him like a refugee carrying sparks hidden in a cloak. The tale has the clean arc of legend. A man arrives, a miracle is made, a city is saved. It may contain truth, it may contain embroidery. But even if Callinicus did create the first effective form, Greek fire quickly became something larger than a single mind. It became institutional, protected, refined, deployed, and mythologized by the state. And here already the mystery takes a firm shape. Because Greek fire seems to have been used repeatedly over centuries. It was not a single lucky trick. It functioned within an empire known for bureaucracy, meaning there were workshops, supply lines, trained specialists, guarded procedures. The weapon was launched from ships using siphons, early flamethrower-like devices, mounted at the bow, so it was not simply throw something burning. It required controlled projection. It required pressure and pipes and valves that would not fail when the sea bucked beneath them. It required containers and storage that could hold volatile liquid without turning the Byzantine fleet into its own funeral pyre. All of that suggests a technology that was both chemical and mechanical, a marriage of recipe and device. And that marriage is part of why the secret proved so durable. You can steal a jar of substance. You can glimpse a flame. But without the system, the materials, the process, the training, you cannot reproduce the effect with any reliability. A weapon is not only what it is made of, it is also how it is used. Still, despite that logic, the details remain elusive. Greek fire's defining feature, the ability to burn on water, has inspired centuries of speculation. Some modern scholars suggest a petroleum or naphtha base, which would float and burn. Others point to sulfur resin and sticky compounds that could make the flames cling to wood and skin. Another long-discussed possibility is quicklime, which reacts violently with water and can release heat, though whether that alone could account for the weapon's behavior is debated. The truth may be a combination, or it may be something we have not guessed correctly yet. The most haunting fact is this: we do not have a confirmed sample. No sealed amphora of Greek fire has waited patiently in a tomb for modern chemistry to unlock. No lab can test what it cannot touch. And even if something were found, the substance would likely have degraded beyond recognition, its volatile elements dispersed long ago into dust and air. So Greek fire remains a mystery, not because no one has thought about it, but because the evidence is stubbornly incomplete. The Byzantines wanted it that way. They guarded the formula with the intensity of a civilization protecting its last advantage. Knowledge was compartmentalized. Responsibility was narrowed. The weapon was treated as a state secret, something that belonged not to the world, but to the empire. And in that choice, we glimpse the deeper theme of this documentary. Greek fire is not merely a burning liquid. It is a portrait of how empires survive, how they ration truth, how they seal expertise inside institutions, how they turn silence into a shield. It is the story of a civilization under pressure learning that the difference between endurance and extinction can be a thing you never allow your enemy to understand. As the night sea settles again in your imagination, the wind softens, the lantern's flame steadies. Far off, the echoes of battle dissolve into the dark, leaving only questions. What exactly was Greek fire, who made it, and how was it kept? Why did the secret endure for so long, only to vanish in the end? For now, let the mystery remain gentle and intact, like a warm glow behind closed doors in a storm-battered city. Constantinople, the unbreakable gate dawn, comes slowly over the Bosporus as if the light itself must negotiate passage into the city. First, there is only a thinning of darkness, charcoal turning to slate, then a faint band of pale gold where the sky meets the water. The wind smells of salt and river silt and distant smoke. Seabirds circle in wide, patient arcs above the strait, crying out as they ride invisible currents. Below them, the sea moves with a peculiar restlessness, pulled by tides and channeled by geography, never fully still. From the deck of a ship approaching the capital, Constantinople does not appear all at once. It emerges in layers. The far line of walls is first gray stone rising from the peninsula like a cliff carved by human hands. Then come towers, domes, rooftops, the thin verticals of masts in the harbor. And at last, as the sun climbs, the city catches fire with light roofs, flashing windows, glinting water scattering brightness in broken shards. This is the place Greek fire was meant to protect. Not simply a city, but an idea of the world held together by stone sea and stubborn continuity. To understand why Greek fire mattered so much, you must understand why Constantinople mattered so much, why it became the prize that armies marched toward and fleets tried to starve. Because Constantinople was not merely the capital of the Byzantine Empire. It was the hinge of the medieval world, the narrow door between continents. Whoever controlled it could influence trade from the Black Sea command passage between Europe and Asia and project power across the eastern Mediterranean. It was also a city designed almost obsessively with defense in mind. The peninsula on which Constantinople stood was naturally protected on three sides by water: the Sea of Marmara to the south, the Bosporus to the east, and the Golden Horn and inland harbor to the north. Only on the western side did the city face the open land of Thrace, and there the Byzantines inherited and expanded one of the most formidable defensive systems in history, the Theodosian walls built in the early 5th century and maintained, repaired, and revered for centuries. Imagine approaching those walls on foot across damp fields after rain. The ground is uneven, your boots sink, wind tugs at your cloak. Ahead, the defenses do not appear like a single barrier, but like a sequence of obstacles meant to exhaust hope. There is a wide ditch, then an outer wall, then an inner wall, higher, thicker, bristling with towers. The stone is cold in the early morning, the mortar darkened by time. Flags move on the battlements. Tiny figures patrol above, watching the world beyond the city as if they have watched it for 1,000 years. Such walls could frustrate the best armies, but walls do not feed the people behind them. A besieged city lives or dies by supply grain, water, timber, morale. If a navy could blockade Constantinople, the stone might hold, while hunger did the conquering. That is why the sea was never merely scenery. It was a battlefield. And the sea around Constantinople is unlike the open ocean. The Bosporus is a narrow, fast-moving strait with tricky currents that reverse and surge. Winds can shift with a little warning, funneling through the channel. In winter, cold rain and sleet can slice across decks. In summer, heat rises from the water in shimmering veils. To sail here is to sail inside a corridor of geography where skill matters and where local knowledge can become an advantage as sharp as a blade. The Golden Horn, too, was a kind of natural weapon. It was a sheltered harbor with a narrow entrance easily guarded. Byzantines famously used a great chain stretched across its mouth in times of danger, denying enemy ships access to the inner harbor. Within that protected water lay docks, warehouses, shipyards, and the lifeblood of the city's maritime trade. In calmer times it was a place of daily labor, shouting stevedores, creaking cranes, the smell of fish and tar, the steady thud of barrels set down on planks. In war it became a throat that had to be closed, so when enemies came, when fleets appeared on the horizon like dark punctuation marks in the bright sea, the question was never just whether Constantinople could outlast an army outside its walls. The question was whether the city could keep the sea from becoming a noose. In the 7th and 8th centuries, as the Arab-Byzantine struggle intensified, these questions became urgent. The new naval power of Byzantium's rivals forced a reckoning the empire could not rely only on land fortifications and diplomacy. It needed a way to break fleets, to scatter them, to frighten them, to make the very act of approaching the city feel cursed. Greek fire enters here not as a mythic flourish, but as a strategic answer. In the imagination, it is easy to picture Greek fire as an isolated marvel, a single ship, a single blast, an impossible flame. But in reality, if it worked as described and worked repeatedly, it was part of a wider system. Constantinople's defense was layered walls, troops, reserves, allies, weather logistics, and crucially the navy. A weapon that could shatter an enemy fleet did not merely win a battle at sea. It kept grain routes open. It prevented the slow tightening of blockade. It preserved the city's breathing room. And it did something else quieter, but perhaps more powerful. It created deterrence. Imagine being an enemy commander in a wooden ship far from your home port, staring at a city that seems to rise from the water like a fortress island. You know the walls are strong. You know your soldiers are brave. But you have heard stories told by men who survived and by men who fled, stories that become heavier each time they are repeated. They say the Byzantines have a flame that cannot be doused. They say it crawls across the sea. They say it sticks to wood and flesh. They say it roars with a sound like a beast. Even if you do not believe everything, uncertainty itself becomes a weapon. It lodges in the mind like grit beneath a fingernail. It changes decisions. It makes captains hesitate at crucial moments. It turns a confident approach into a cautious one, and cautious fleets are slower, easier to disrupt, easier to outmaneuver in narrow waters. This is part of Greek fire's true power, not only what it burned, but what it made people think could happen. And Constantinople was the ideal stage for that kind of terror, not theatrical terror, but strategic dread. The city was already wrapped in symbolism. It was the Christian capital of an empire that saw itself as Rome's heir. It held relics, ceremonies, institutions, histories written in stone and chant. For its defenders, saving Constantinople was not merely saving a government, it was saving a world. For its attackers, taking it promised not merely wealth, but legitimacy, a reshaping of the map. So the sea battles outside its harbors were never small. Even when only a handful of ships clashed under a gray sky, the stakes felt immense, like a weight pressing down on the water itself. And in such a place, secret mattered. The Byzantines understood that technology, especially military technology, was not only about inventing something, it was about sustaining it, training crews, guarding workshops, securing ingredients, controlling knowledge, turning invention into policy. Greek fire, in other words, was a weapon of the city. It belonged to Constantinople's geography, to its harbors, and shipyards, to its bureaucracy and careful paranoia. The city's survival depended on countless invisible routines: taxes collected, grain stored, ships repaired, orders copied, sentries posted, chains raised and lowered. Greek fire was woven into that tapestry like a hidden thread, bright only when it burst into flame. As the morning fully arrives over the Bosporus, the city looks serene from a distance. Sunlight softens its edges. The water gleams, but calm is only the surface layer. Beneath it lies a long memory of sieges, storms, and sudden violence. And somewhere in that memory, always is the same image: enemy ships turning toward the capital, and the sea answering them with fire. The century of collapse. The 7th century does not arrive with a single trumpet blast. It comes like weather, slowly, relentlessly changing the air before people even notice the sky has shifted. In Constantinople, the seasons still turn, markets still open, church bells still mark the hours. But underneath the familiar rhythms, something begins to fray confidence resources, the old assumption that Rome's world will always endure. You can feel it first in the harbors. The smell of tar and salt remains, but the ships that arrive seem more cautious, their hulls more worn, their crews quieter. Merchants speak in lowered voices about roads that are no longer safe, about taxes rising, about provinces that once sent grain and gold now sending nothing at all. A sailor points to the horizon and talks about raids, fast attacks that vanish before a response can gather. A clerk in a warehouse counts sacks and realizes the numbers do not match last year's totals. The empire's life is measured in such ordinary details. And then, like a crack spreading through stone, the map begins to change. For centuries, the Roman Mediterranean had been a shared space, imperfect, violent at times, but connected. The Byzantines inherited that world, and they inherited its burdens, defending long frontiers, managing competing elites, sustaining a complex economy, keeping armies paid and supplied. Even in better times, it was a constant balancing act. But the early 7th century brought a convergence of pressures so heavy that even the most disciplined administration could not absorb them without losing shape. First came exhausting wars with the Sasanian Persians. These were not small border skirmishes, but vast grinding conflicts that reached into the heart of the empire. Cities fell, provinces were ravaged, tax bases collapsed, populations were displaced. Armies marched and marched again, wearing down the empire's strength like waves wearing down a cliff. When peace finally came, it did not come with restoration. It came with exhaustion. And then almost immediately came something new. From the Arabian Peninsula emerged armies driven by a force the Byzantines did not yet fully understand: the early Islamic conquests. They moved with speed and unity that shocked older imperial assumptions. In the space of a few decades, Byzantine provinces that had once seemed permanent, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, shifted into new hands. These were not just territories on a parchment map. They were the empire's lungs and stomach, its grain supply, its tax revenue, its recruitment pools. Losing them changed everything. The Eastern Mediterranean had been Byzantium's center of gravity. Now that gravity pulled inward toward the Aegean and the capital itself. And in such moments the sea becomes more dangerous, not because it changes, but because everything depends on it. When land routes become uncertain and provinces fall away, the navy becomes a lifeline. The empire must move troops by water-protect supply routes and stop enemy fleets from doing the same. Control of the sea, especially the narrow waters around Constantinople, becomes existential. This was not the old Roman situation where the Mediterranean could be treated as an internal lake, patrolled and taxed. This was a new world where rivals could contest sea lanes, where coastal raids could bleed the empire like 1,000 small cuts, where a blockade could starve a city no wall could protect. But it took time for the threat to fully mature. Naval power is not created overnight. It requires shipyards, trained crews, experienced commanders, and the slow accumulation of maritime knowledge. In the early stages of the Arab-Byzantine conflict, the Byzantines still held a degree of naval advantage, legacy, infrastructure, inherited expertise, and control of key ports. Yet the new power rising in the south and east learned quickly. Fleets began to appear where previously only armies had marched. And once enemy fleets exist, the very concept of safety changes. A coastal town that once feared only armies now fears ships landing without warning. Islands become vulnerable. Trade becomes uncertain. Fishermen look out to sea and see more than weather. They see possibility of capture, of fire, of disappearance. In Constantinople, the imperial court watches these developments with the particular anxiety of people who know that geography is both their shield and their trap. The city's position makes it powerful, but also makes it a target. And as the 7th century rolls onward, it becomes increasingly clear that the conflict is not simply about far provinces. It is about the capital itself. The first Arab siege of Constantinople, often placed in the late 670s, arrives as the culmination of this tightening pressure. Even if details in sources vary, the broad reality is clear enemy forces attempt to bring the empire's heart to heel. The siege is not just a military event. It is psychological warfare. It is the world testing whether Constantinople is truly unbreakable or merely unbroken so far. Picture the city during such a time. The sky is gray, heavy with cloud. The wind off the Marmara cuts through cloaks. Smoke rises from hearths and from watchtowers. On the walls, sentries stamp their feet to keep warmth in their legs, their breath visible in the cold air. Inside the city, food is rationed. Bakers measure flour carefully. Families listen for news in the street, scanning faces for fear. Priests chant prayers that are both comfort and defiance, as if sound itself could strengthen stone. Outside the walls, enemy camps spread like dark stains. Fires burn, horses shift and snort. The clink of metal carries in the wind. And out on the water, out where the city's land walls cannot help enemy ships gather, watching the harbors waiting to choke the city's supply. This is the moment where Greek fire begins to matter, not as an abstract secret weapon, but as a tool of survival. Because even the strongest empire cannot defend everything at once. The Byzantines are adapting to a world where they are no longer the dominant power everywhere. They are learning to be smaller, tougher, more specialized. They are learning to choose what to protect and what to abandon. They are reorganizing their military and administrative structures in ways that will later be known as the theme system, local defense zones, more regionally grounded forces, a different kind of resilience. It is a transformation born from necessity. Greek fire fits into that transformation. It represents an empire that can no longer rely on size alone. It must rely on advantage, on something the enemy cannot easily match. And the truly eerie thing about Greek fire in this context is that it feels like an answer tailored to the 7th century's new reality. The enemy's growing naval threat demands a naval solution. The siege of a sea-ringed city demands a weapon that can dominate water. And the empire's shrinking resources demand a force multiplier, something that allows fewer ships to break more ships, fewer defenders to keep an entire coastline uncertain for attackers. When sources describe Greek fire being used against enemy fleets during the siege, the image is not just of destruction, it is of relief. A city that has been holding its breath finally exhales. The blockade breaks. Enemy ships burn. Panic spreads across decks. The sea, which had threatened to become a cage, becomes an ally again. Yet for all the vividness of that scene, we must remain careful. Medieval sources often write with dramatic flourish. They compress time. They exaggerate for moral effect. They may describe Greek fire as if it were a miracle, a divine favor, granted to the Christian Empire. And indeed, for Byzantines living through sieges, any salvation would have felt like a miracle. But the deeper truth is perhaps even more fascinating. Greek fire may have been an engineered miracle, an innovation, born not from divine intervention, but from human fear, ingenuity, and administrative discipline. And still the mystery lingers, because Greek fire appears in our sources like lightning, bright, terrifying, and brief. We see the effect, but we do not see the full mechanism. We know it existed because it shaped behavior and was repeatedly referenced. Yet we do not have the quiet documentation that would satisfy modern certainty, exact ingredients, production records, technical diagrams. So we stand at the edge of a century that is collapsing and transforming at the same time. The Byzantines are losing land, losing revenue, losing old assumptions. But they are also becoming something new, an empire that survives by adaptation, by strategic concentration, and by secrets. The 7th century, in other words, is not only decline, it is the crucible. And in that crucible, somewhere in workshops and shipyards and guarded rooms, someone is learning how to make fire behave like a weapon of water. Callinicus of Heliopolis. There are moments in history when a single name seems to glow at the edge of catastrophe, half person, half legend, like a figure seen through smoke. Callinicus of Heliopolis is one of those names. Picture a shoreline in the eastern Mediterranean late afternoon turning slowly toward dusk. The air smells of salt and damp rope, and the light lies low and coppery on the water. A small vessel rocks at a pier. Men speak in hurried tones, glancing over shoulders, as if the horizon itself has become dangerous. Somewhere inland, the world is changing cities, changing hands, armies redrawing borders, old certainties breaking like clay underfoot. And in the midst of that movement, a craftsman gathers what he can carry, tools, notes, memory method. Not treasure, not relics, something stranger and more valuable, knowledge. This part of the story is about that fragile kind of wealth, because Greek fire is not only a weapon that burns, it is a weapon that must be remembered to exist. And in the Byzantine tradition, the beginning of that remembered chain is often pinned to one man, a refugee engineer from Syria, arriving with an idea that could save an empire. The sources that tell us this do not speak with modern clarity. They come to us through centuries of copying, summarizing, retelling. They were written by chroniclers who cared as much about meaning as mechanics, and who sometimes wrapped technical events in moral language God's protection, Rome's destiny, the punishment of enemies. But amid that atmosphere, the name persists. Callinicus, sometimes spelled Callinicos of Heliopolis. Heliopolis in the Byzantine world points us eastward. It suggests the region of Syria, a landscape of ancient cities and learned traditions, where artisans and engineers lived alongside monks, merchants, and soldiers. It was a place where practical knowledge could be inherited and adapted the handling of oils and resins, the working of metals, the building of pumps and pipes, the management of heat. We should not romanticize it into a laboratory of miracles, but neither should we forget that late antique and early medieval societies possessed real technical skill, especially in places where trade and craft had long flourished. So the traditional story unfolds with a certain quiet plausibility. As the Arab conquest swept through the eastern provinces, skilled people moved. Some fled, some were captured, some adapted, and some perhaps crossed the sea toward Constantinople, seeking safety in the empire's last great fortress city. Callinicus is said to have been one of them. In the telling, he arrives around the early 670s, just as the empire faces a rising naval threat and the looming danger of a siege. He brings with him the knowledge to create an incendiary weapon unlike anything the Byzantines' enemies had seen. The empire, desperate for advantage, takes that knowledge and guards it fiercely. Greek fire appears soon after, during the clashes that surround the first great assault on Constantinople. It is a clean narrative, almost too clean, one of those historical arcs that feel designed for memory. A city is threatened, a man arrives, a secret is born, the enemy burns, the empire survives, and that is exactly where the mystery begins. Because when historians look closely, they find that the evidence for Callinicus is real, but not as complete as the legend suggests. We do not possess his writings. We do not have an imperial document that says plainly, this man invented Greek fire on this date in this workshop using these ingredients. Instead, we have later references in chronicles that associate him with the invention. Those references matter. Byzantine chroniclers were not inventing names casually, yet they were also writing within traditions of attributing inventions to notable figures, of compressing complex developments into singular origins. So we must hold Callinicus with a gentle, careful grip. He may have been the inventor, he may have been the introducer of a method already known in fragments. He may have been the organizer who turned scattered knowledge into a working system. Or he may have become, over time, the symbolic face of a technology that was developed by many hands. To investigate the question, we have to think like both historian and engineer. First, consider the problem Greek fire solved. Byzantium needed a weapon that could dominate naval engagements in narrow waters, one that could break enemy formations, frighten crews, and ignite wooden ships quickly. Ordinary incendiaries existed, pitch oil-burning arrows, flaming pots. But Greek fire was described as different, projected in a stream fiercely burning, difficult to extinguish, sometimes said to burn on water. That points to a compound and delivery system that required experimentation and craft. Could a single person in a time of crisis create such a thing? Possibly, especially if he carried prior knowledge, but it is more likely that any invention at this level was an assemblage, existing materials, known reactions, mechanical devices like pumps and siphons combined and refined through trial until they became reliably terrifying. In that sense, Callinicus does not have to be a lone genius to be historically meaningful. He could be the catalyst, the person who knew enough and arrived at the right moment, and convinced the state to invest in development and secrecy. Then consider the context of the Byzantine state. Constantinople was not only a city, it was a machine of administration. It could mobilize resources, assign specialists, build fleets, and establish guarded workshops. If an engineer arrived with a promising method, the empire had the capacity to absorb it, transforming a private technique into a state monopoly. That, in fact, is one of the most Byzantine aspects of Greek fire, not merely its chemistry, but its institutionalization. So we come to the leading theories about Callinicus's role. One possibility is the straightforward one. He devised the formula and the projection method, and the empire adopted it. Another is that he brought knowledge of flammable oils, naphtha, petroleum seep products from regions where such materials were known and used, and that Byzantine engineers then adapted it into a weapon system. A third possibility is that Callinicus became a later label for a broader tradition, a way of saying the secret came from the East during the crisis, through a learned man whose name carried authority. And why does it remain uncertain? Because the Byzantines had every reason to keep it uncertain. If the state truly treated Greek fire as a guarded secret, known only to select specialists, produced under controlled conditions, and protected by strict compartmentalization, then the surviving written record would be intentionally thin. Manuals might describe how to deploy the weapon without recording how to make it. Chroniclers might celebrate its effects while remaining vague on its nature. Even within the empire, knowledge could be restricted to families or guild-like groups whose expertise was passed down orally, not committed to parchment that could be captured, stolen, or copied. This is what makes the Callinicus story so haunting. It sits at the meeting point of human biography and systematic silence. We can almost see the outline of a man moving through history, yet the very success of the weapon depended on erasing the trail behind him. In the end, perhaps the most honest way to speak of Callinicus is not as a solved identity, but as a doorway into the deeper mystery. His name reminds us that Greek fire was made by people who had to measure, mix, test, and risk failure, people who had to work under the pressure of war, people whose hands smelled of oil and ash, whose clothes carried soot, whose minds held dangerous knowledge that could not be spoken freely. And as night returns over the water, the city's lamps flicker on one by one along the shore. The Bosporus darkens again, and the sound of the waves becomes a steady hush. Somewhere in some workshop sealed against curious eyes, a substance is being prepared, thick, volatile secret. Whether Callinicus stood there himself or whether his story stands in for many unseen artisans, the effect is the same. A weapon begins to exist that will keep Constantinople breathing. Not through brute strength alone, but through a guarded flame passed hand to hand, generation to generation, like a secret prayer. The first trial, fire before the walls. There is a particular kind of silence that comes before a naval battle, an uneasy listening silence, because the sea carries sound differently. Even far away you can hear the faint knock of wood against wood, the creak of a mast, the rhythm of oars biting water. In the early morning off Constantinople, that silence feels heavier, as if the city itself is holding its breath. A low mist lies over the Bosporus. The water is cold and metallic, the color of hammered lead. On the horizon, shadows gather ships, many of them moving with a measured confidence. Their sails are furled for control. Their oars pull in long, synchronized strokes. The air smells of damp rope and pitch. Men on the Byzantine ships speak quietly, not wanting to waste breath, not wanting to admit fear aloud. They can see the enemy now, dark hulls, sharp prows, the suggestion of soldiers clustered along the rails. And behind the Byzantine line, the city rises like a promise, walls, towers, domes catching the faint light. Constantinople watches from the shore, a mass of stone and human life that cannot retreat. If the sea is lost, the city's great fortifications become an island's last defense, strong but increasingly hungry. This is the moment tradition remembers as the first great proving of Greek fire, not in theory, not as a whispered secret, but as something unleashed under open sky where thousands would see what it could do and carry the memory into the future. The broad outlines of the historical context are clear even when details vary in different sources. In the late 670s, the first major Arab attempt to seize Constantinople builds toward a long, grinding pressure. The attackers bring forces by land and sea, aiming to isolate the capital. For the Byzantines, this is not a routine campaign. This is survival. The empire has already lost provinces, wealth, and manpower. What remains must be defended with everything available: walls, diplomacy, weather, and the navy. And now, perhaps for the first time, something new waits on the Byzantine ships. Not a miracle in the sky, not an omen, a device. On the bow of a warship beneath a protective awning, and surrounded by men who look unusually tense, a metal tube sits like the snout of an animal. Pipes run back into the ship's body, disappearing into the shadowed space where the dangerous substance is stored. A pump, hand-operated or driven by pressure, stands ready. The crew assigned to it are not ordinary sailors. They move with the focused care of people handling something that can betray them. Their hands are dark with oil, their faces are set. They speak to one another in short phrases, as if too many words might wake the fire before its time. In the distance, the enemy fleet draws closer. The sea between the lines narrows. You can hear shouts, now the clatter of shields, the hollow drum of oars striking water. The wind shifts, and the Byzantine crew instinctively notices. Wind matters. Wind can turn a weapon outward or blow it back into your own sails. And then comes the command. It might be a gesture, it might be a shouted word. We do not know the exact phrasing, but we can imagine the moment when trained hands begin to work the mechanism, pumping, building pressure, guiding flow. The metal tube tilts slightly. The ship holds its line. For a heartbeat, nothing happens, only the hiss of water and the groan of wood. Then the bow erupts. A stream of fire leaps out, not as a simple flaming arrow, but as a continuous roaring projection. It arcs across the space and strikes the leading enemy ship. The effect is immediate, not only because something burns, but because of how it burns. The flame clings, it spreads like poured liquid. It crawls along the hull, reaching for the seams where pitch and rope and dry wood invite it in. Men scramble with buckets instinctively, throwing water, the oldest response to fire. But water fails. The flames do not drown. They flicker and rage on the surface, feeding on floating oils. They spit thick smoke, dark, choking, stinging. The sound is different too, not just crackling, but a roaring rush like an angry furnace. For sailors used to ordinary incendiaries, this is bewildering. Fire is supposed to be tamed by sea. Fire is supposed to fear water. Here the sea seems powerless. Panic spreads faster than flame. It jumps ship to ship through shouts and gestures, through the sight of men leaping overboard, through the sudden realization that the water offers no safety. Some try to cut ropes to pull away to retreat. Others surge forward blindly, hoping to close distance before the Byzantines can unleash another blast. But formation breaks, oars clash, ships collide. The enemy fleet becomes a tangle of hesitation and terror. If you step back from the drama, you can see the strategic brilliance of it. Greek fire does not need to burn every ship to be decisive, it needs only to break coherence. In naval warfare, order is everything: lines, timing, coordinated movement. Once panic fractures, that order a fleet becomes vulnerable, not just to fire, but to ramming, to boarding, to being pushed into unfavorable currents. This is why the Byzantines invested in the weapon. It multiplied their power. It allowed fewer ships to throw a larger fleet into confusion. It turned the Bosporus with its narrow channels and shifting winds into a trap for those who lost discipline. But Greek fire is not only a tactical tool. In this first great trial, it becomes something else, a story that will travel. The attackers survive to tell it. Not all, of course. Many burn, many drown. But enough witness it, enough flee to carry the account into their own cultures. And as stories travel, they change shape. They grow more dramatic. They become warnings. They become legends. This is how weapons become myths, not by being unbelievable, but by being memorable. We should be cautious with the specifics. Medieval chronicles can exaggerate numbers and compress sequences. The siege of Constantinople was not won by a single blast on a single morning. It was a prolonged conflict shaped by logistics, weather diplomacy, and endurance. The Byzantines also benefited from the city's massive walls and supply management, and the attackers faced the harsh reality of sustaining a siege over months, even years, in a region where storms and scarcity could be as deadly as swords. Yet, even if Greek fire was one part of a larger defensive picture, it was a part that mattered profoundly. It changed naval assumptions. It gave the Byzantines a psychological edge. It offered a way to turn the sea from vulnerability into defense. And perhaps most importantly, it revealed something about the Byzantine state, its ability to protect a secret. Because after this first trial, the obvious question arises, one that would have been asked by every enemy commander who heard the story, and perhaps by every curious Byzantine too. What is it made of? In the moment of battle, no one knows, only that it burns. But afterward, when the smoke clears and charred planks float on the water, the mystery becomes irresistible. If the enemy could learn the formula, they could neutralize the advantage. They could build their own siphons. They could make the sea burn in return. And yet, according to tradition and repeated later testimony, they could not. Even when Byzantine ships were captured, even when the weapon was witnessed, even when rumors of ingredients circulated, the secret remained protected. Which suggests that Greek fire was not simply a jar of flammable liquid. It was a process, a chain of supply and technique, a disciplined system of handling storage and deployment. The Byzantines had learned how to hide not only information, but the path to reproducing it. As the day fades, the waters outside Constantinople settle again. Ash drifts down like black snow. The city's walls stand unchanged, but something in the world has shifted. A new fear has entered the sea. A new confidence has entered the defenders. And in the empire's guarded spaces, behind workshop doors, inside shipyards, within circles of trusted specialists, the lesson of this first trial will be studied and refined. Not just how to burn ships, but how to keep the flame theirs alone. Siphons and sea dragons. By daylight, after the smoke has thinned and the last splinters have drifted into calmer water, the sea looks innocent again, blue, wind-creased, almost serene. It is one of the strangest cruelties of the world. How quickly it resets itself, how easily it hides what it has witnessed. But the men who have seen Greek fire do not forget. They remember the sound first, the roar, not like a campfire, but like something forced, pressurized, alive. They remember the way the flame did not simply land on a ship, but seemed to take hold of it, clinging to wood and rope, as if it had hands. And in the telling, as the story travels from mouth to mouth, the weapon begins to acquire a kind of personality. It is no longer merely an incendiary. It is a creature. In later Byzantine descriptions, the projection of Greek fire is sometimes imagined like a dragon's breath spewed from the prow of a ship through a tube that might itself be fashioned in some accounts and artistic depictions to resemble the open mouth of a beast. Whether that detail is literal, decorative, or symbolic is difficult to say. Byzantines, like many medieval peoples, understood the power of imagery. They knew that war was fought not only with iron and flame, but with perception, what the enemy believes about you, what they fear in the moment they hesitate. Still, beneath the theater, there was a hard engineering problem that had to be solved if Greek fire was to be more than a one-time terror. How do you throw a burning liquid reliably at distance from a moving ship without setting yourself on fire first? It is easy from far away to imagine a simple act: light a substance, hurl it, watch it burn. But the sources suggest something more controlled and more frightening. Greek fire projected in a continuous stream, like a medieval flamethrower. This implies a mechanism, and mechanisms require materials, pressure, and practice. The Byzantine term most often associated with the device is a siphon, a word that in modern times suggests a gentle flow of liquid, but in this context implies something far more forceful. A siphon here is not a passive tube. It is a projection system, a way to propel a liquid under pressure and ignite it at the point of release. Imagine the bow of a warship reinforced to hold the weight and stress of an apparatus. A tube, likely metal, perhaps bronze or iron, extends forward. Inside the ship, the flammable mixture must be stored in a container that can survive the motion of waves and the heat of nearby flames. There must be a method for pressurizing the liquid, possibly a hand pump, possibly a piston, possibly bellows, possibly a combination. The technology for pumps and pressure was not unknown in the ancient and late antique world. Water pumps existed. Hydraulic devices existed. The question is not whether Byzantines could make pumping systems, but whether they could make one safe and reliable enough to use with a volatile incendiary. And then there is the question of ignition. If the liquid were expelled without ignition, it might splatter harmlessly, or at least less effectively. The fearsome accounts depend on a stream that is already aflame as it arcs toward the enemy. That suggests an ignition point at or near the nozzle, perhaps a burning wick, perhaps a heated element, perhaps a small pilot flame protected from wind. But open flame at the bow of a ship is itself dangerous. Wind can shift. Spray can dampen. A sudden gust could carry the flame backward. In a sea battle, everything is motion, the pitching of decks, the strain of turns, the confusion of collision. So if Greek fire was indeed projected as a steady, flaming stream, the Byzantines must have developed procedures, almost rituals of timing and positioning. They would need to consider the wind before firing. They would need disciplined crews trained to operate the pump in rhythm. They would need secure storage and careful handling, so the weapon did not become a curse that devoured its own ship. This is one reason the secret may have endured. The formula alone would not have been enough. Greek fire was likely a system, a marriage of chemistry, mechanical engineering, and specialized training. An enemy might capture a container of substance, but without the apparatus and the practiced coordination, they might only reproduce a crude and unreliable version. Meanwhile, the Byzantines refined not just what the mixture was, but how it was deployed, where to aim, when to fire, how long to project, how to retreat before their own flames could spread. Modern investigators trying to reconstruct Greek fire in the imagination often begin with the same stubborn reality: the Byzantine world left us descriptions, not blueprints. We have hints in chronicles and manuals, but not a detailed technical diagram. There are references to siphons mounted on ships and later mentions of handheld devices, Cheirosiphons, literally hand siphons, suggesting smaller versions for use on land or in close combat. There are accounts of ceramic containers used like grenades hurled onto enemy ships or into siege works. These different delivery methods imply that Greek fire was adaptable, not one single device, but a family of techniques built around a core incendiary concept. Yet none of this answers the most intimate question: how did it feel to operate? Try to imagine the men assigned to the siphon crew. They would have been trained not only in seamanship, but in caution. They would have known that one mistake could turn a ship into a funeral pyre. The smell around their station would be heavy, oily, sharp, resinous. Their hands might be stained. Their clothing might carry a faint sheen. They might avoid open lanterns near the storage space. When battle approached, their pulse would rise not only from fear of the enemy, but from fear of their own weapon's temper. And perhaps that is why some descriptions emphasize noise and smoke. A pressurized system expelling burning liquid would not be silent. It would hiss, roar, perhaps even spit, especially if the mixture contained volatile elements that ignited violently upon release. The thick smoke reported in sources could be partly chemical. Burning oils and resins produce heavy smoke, and partly environmental, as ships and ropes and tar caught and smoldered. Even the dragon imagery might have practical roots. A metal nozzle shaped as an animal head could serve as both decoration and intimidation. Yes, but it could also serve as a protective housing for the ignition point, shielding a pilot flame from wind. The shape could channel the stream, stabilize it, keep it from splashing back. We cannot be sure this was common practice, but it is the kind of plausible detail that sits between poetry and engineering. And still the deeper mystery remains: if the Byzantines could build such devices, why did their enemies not eventually develop similar projection systems? Part of the answer may lie in the empire's long tradition of specialized state workshops, arsenals, and shipyards linked to imperial authority, where techniques could be guarded and passed down within controlled circles. Part may lie in materials and infrastructure, reliable metalworking, consistent production of fittings, the ability to maintain devices over decades. Part may lie in disciplined training crews establishing doctrine and integrating the weapon into naval tactics, and part may lie in geography. Greek fire was most effective where Byzantium fought best narrow waters, controlled harbors, defensive engagements, where the empire could choose when to reveal the flame. When you consider all of this, Greek fire begins to look less like a single secret ingredient and more like a living tradition, one that could not be stolen easily, because it was not just a thing. It was a way of doing war. As evening settles again over the Golden Horn, the harbor darkens into a mirror. The city's lamps bloom along the shoreline, soft points of amber in a growing blue. In shipyards, the day's labor slows. Tools are set down, ropes are coiled, but somewhere behind guarded doors, the empire's careful people continue their work, inspecting metal tubes, checking valves, sealing containers, rehearsing motions that must be precise when the sea turns violent. The flame that burns on water is terrifying enough, but the device that makes it leap, controlled, directed, repeatable, is what turns terror into strategy. And now, as the mechanics come into focus, another question rises, quieter but sharper. If we can understand how Greek fire was thrown, can we also understand what witnesses truly saw, what their eyes and lungs and skin remembered, in the moments when the sea itself seemed to betray them? Sticky flame. What witnesses saw. The strange thing about terror is that it does not always announce itself with screams. Sometimes it arrives as a silence, an instant, where the mind recognizes something it cannot categorize, and for a heartbeat, it simply stops. That may have been the first sensation many sailors felt when Greek fire appeared, not pain, not even fear yet, but disbelief. A flame was moving in a way flame should not move. Imagine the scene again, but closer, close enough that you can hear individual breaths and the slap of small waves against planks. The air is salted and damp. Your clothing is heavy with spray. The ship rolls gently, and you grip a rope for balance. Ahead, the Byzantine vessel turns its bow slightly, not rushing, almost calm. For a moment you think you understand the situation. Ships clash, men board, wood burns. You have seen that before. Then the bow of the enemy ship blossoms with fire, and the world tilts into a different category of memory. What witnesses describe when they describe Greek fire at all is often not a neat inventory of facts, but a handful of sensory impressions: heat, smoke, noise, adhesion, and the terrible certainty that water will not save you. These elements repeat across accounts because they are the kind of details people do not forget. They are physical, not philosophical. They belong to the body first and to the story later. The flame, they say, came as a stream, not a scattered shower of sparks, but a directed projection, something thrown with intention. Even if chroniclers did not understand the mechanism, they recognized control. This was not an accidental blaze. It was a weapon that could be aimed, released, and crucially repeated. Then there is the matter of the smoke. We tend to imagine medieval fires as clean orange light, but real burning, especially burning oils, resins, tarred, ropes, and treated wood, makes a smoke that is thick and aggressive. It pushes into the eyes, stings, the throat clings to hair and cloth. On the water, smoke behaves like a low fog, drifting and pooling depending on wind. If the sea is calm, smoke can settle over decks and turn a ship into a choking room without walls. Witnesses often speak of the smoke because it was part of the weapon's power. A sailor cannot fight well when he cannot see. A crew cannot coordinate when men are coughing, and blinded when tears stream down their faces. The smoke breaks discipline, the quiet, invisible framework that keeps a ship functional in battle. And then the sound. This is one of the most haunting details. Greek fire is remembered not only as flame, but as noise. A roaring, rushing sound, sometimes described as if it were alive. That might be exaggeration, but it might also be the honest memory of a pressurized discharge, the hiss and roar of something forced through a tube igniting as it leaves, accompanied by the crackle of rapidly burning liquid and the groan of wood beginning to fail. Fire is rarely silent, and in the confined space of ships clustered on water, the sound would be amplified, echoed off hulls, and carried across the surface. When people cannot explain a sound, they give it a creature's voice. They call it a beast, a dragon, a demon, not because they truly believe it is one, at least not always, but because language reaches for metaphors when the mind is overwhelmed. But the most distinctive element, the one that made Greek fire feel like a betrayal of nature, is the way it seemed to cling. Many ordinary incendiaries burn and then move on. Greek fire in the tradition behaves differently. It sticks, it crawls, it adheres to surfaces. If it was based on petroleum-like substances mixed with resins and other thickening agents, that adhesion makes sense. A viscous, burning liquid would splatter and cling, continuing to burn where it lands. The result would be horrifyingly intimate. It would not be a distant fire on a nearby ship. It would be something on your deck, on your ropes, on your shields, on your skin. That is where panic becomes absolute. A sailor can endure many things in battle, arrows, shouts, even wounds, because he can still imagine survival. He can imagine retreat. He can imagine a path through the chaos. But a fire that clings erases those mental escape routes. It makes every movement feel dangerous. It turns the simplest decisions into traps. Do you run? The flame catches your cloak. Do you throw yourself into the sea? The fire follows you, or seems to. Do you smother it with cloth? The cloth ignites. Do you pour water? The water fails. Even if in reality Greek fire could sometimes be extinguished by certain means, sand, earth perhaps, vinegar-like mixtures, perhaps simply depriving it of oxygen, battle is not a laboratory. In the moment you do not test theories, you react. And the oldest instinct, water, was reported to be ineffective. That single fact is what turns fear into legend. It is also why the psychological impact may have been as decisive as the physical damage. Consider what it means for morale when a crew believes the enemy possesses a weapon that ignores the sea. A ship is a fragile thing. It is wood rope and faith held together by skill. Every sailor knows that fire is one of its deadliest enemies. Even a small blaze can end a voyage. In battle, that fear is always present. Tarred ropes and sails are eager to burn. So when Greek fire appears, it is not introducing a new fear. It is taking an existing fear and making it unstoppable. In many accounts, the victims respond not with organized resistance, but with flight, jumping overboard, cutting anchors, breaking formation, abandoning ships. This is not cowardice. It is a rational response to an irrational seeming threat. It is what happens when the body decides the mind is taking too long to understand. And yet, as we listen to these testimonies, direct or filtered through chroniclers, we must keep a quiet scholar's caution. Medieval writers often described events in ways that emphasized divine favor or moral lessons. An enemy fleet burning might be portrayed as proof of God's protection. The Byzantines, the Romans, might be framed as rightful defenders of the true faith. The weapon might be described in terms that heighten wonder, because wonder itself is a rhetorical tool. So how do we read witness descriptions responsibly? We look for repeating patterns across different sources and contexts. We treat dramatic language as data about experience, even if it is not data about chemistry. We pay attention to what is plausible: thick smoke from burning oils and resins, roaring sound from pressurized projection and rapid combustion, adhesion from viscous mixtures, water failing to extinguish floating burning fuel. None of these require supernatural explanation. They require only a particular combination of ingredients and delivery. At the same time, we recognize that fear can magnify. A flame that floats on water might become, in retelling, a flame that feeds on water. A weapon used effectively in a few engagements might become in legend a weapon that never failed. A controlled stream might become a continuous dragon breath that lasts forever. Memory is not a photograph. It is a narrative shaped by emotion, and that is precisely what makes Greek fire so enduring as a mystery. We are trying to reconstruct a weapon from the residue it left in human minds, minds shocked by a new kind of danger. In the absence of a preserved formula, witness testimony becomes one of our main clues. Yet it is also the most treacherous clue because it is soaked in adrenaline and fear. Still, there is something honest in these accounts, something that survives. The exaggeration, Greek fire changed what sailors believed was possible. It rewrote their relationship with the sea. It made the surface of water, normally a refuge from flame, feel uncertain, and once that belief takes root, it does not vanish quickly. It passes from veteran to recruit, from harbor tavern to war council, from rumor to doctrine. As night settles again over the Bosporus, you can imagine an enemy crew anchored far from the city speaking in murmurs. A man describes what he saw, how the flame clung, how the smoke choked, how the water failed him. Others listen in silence, their faces pale in lantern light. Beyond them, the sea moves softly indifferent. But in their minds, the sea has acquired a new possibility that it can burn. The Second Siege. A city that would not burn the sea around Constantinople can look gentle in summer blue and bright, with the kind of sunlight that makes every wave appear harmless. But anyone who has sailed these waters knows the truth. The Bosporus is a corridor of moods. Wind changes without warning. Currents tug at keels like unseen hands. Storms can rise quickly, and winter can turn the surface into a cold, punishing mirror. In the year 717, the city waited beneath that shifting sky with the quiet intensity of a creature listening for footsteps. The threat this time was not a raid, not a probing attack, but a full attempt to end the empire's story. The Umayyad Caliphate, then one of the most powerful forces in the region, moved with land armies and fleets toward the Byzantine capital. Constantinople had survived sieges before, but each one carried the same essential terror. If the city fell, the empire's center would be severed. Not merely a political defeat, a collapse of continuity. You can imagine the city as the siege begins. The air is still warm, but it carries a nervous dryness, like a season holding its breath. People crowd the markets to secure grain. The sound of hammers echoes from the walls as repairs are rushed. Priests chant in churches whose candles burn day and night, not as spectacle, but as steady comfort, small flames of order against an approaching darkness. At the harbors, sailors check ropes, caulk seams, sharpened tools. On the water, the imperial fleet holds itself ready, not moving too far from the protection of the city's geography. And beyond the horizon, ships gather, many ships, dark shapes, turning the sea into a threat. The Arab commander, Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, is often named in the accounts as the leader of the land forces. The fleet, too, becomes central to the siege's ambition to surround Constantinople, to cut supply lines, to make the city's mighty walls irrelevant by starving what they protect. In the medieval imagination, a siege is often pictured as ladders against stone and battering rams at gates. But Constantinople was different. Its walls were too formidable to rush easily. Its real vulnerability lay in endurance, how long it could feed itself while the world tried to close in. So the sea mattered perhaps more than ever. The Byzantines understood this with the calm clarity of people who had lived through earlier storms. They raised defenses. They guarded the Golden Horn. They relied on the chain that could deny entry to the harbor. They positioned ships where currents and narrow channels could become allies. And somewhere within their preparations, Greek fire waited quietly, like a sleeping animal that could be awakened at the right moment. The sources tell us that Greek fire was used again during this siege, especially in naval encounters where the attackers attempted to break the city's maritime control. If we picture it in documentary detail, it is not a single theatrical moment, but a repeating pattern, a strategy woven into the defense. An enemy ship approaches confident in numbers. Its crew believes momentum will overwhelm the defenders. The Byzantine ships do not always rush out to meet it. Sometimes they hold position, forcing the enemy into unfavorable waters, making them fight where wind and current are less forgiving. The city's defenders are not merely brave, they are calculating. They know that Greek fire is most effective when it can be used decisively, when a formation is tight, when escape routes are limited, when panic will spread like ink in water. And then, at the chosen moment, the fire is released. The stream leaps outward. The smell of burning oil rolls across the waves. Smoke thickens. The sound rises, roaring, hissing, cracking. And suddenly the enemy's advantage in numbers begins to dissolve into confusion. Ships try to turn away, but turning takes time. Oars clash. Hulls collide. A fleet becomes a crowd. And once it becomes a crowd, it becomes vulnerable. But the second siege was not won by Greek fire alone, and that is part of what makes it so human and so chilling. Because the true enemy of an invading army is often not a wall. It is time. As months pass, the siege becomes a test of logistics and suffering. The attackers must feed men and animals far from home. They must keep morale intact through cold nights and sickness. They must maintain coordination between land and sea forces as weather changes. Meanwhile, inside Constantinople, the defenders ration grain, manage fear, and cling to routine, the steady pulse of a city refusing to become a corpse. Then winter arrives. The air sharpens. The wind off the water feels like a blade. Snow and ice transform the landscape. The siege camps outside the walls face a kind of misery that stone towers do not protect against. Fires burn low. Supplies strain. Disease becomes more likely. And on the sea, storms and winter conditions make naval operations harder and more dangerous. This is where the story of Greek fire becomes intertwined with the larger mystery of survival. Because Greek fire, for all its terror, is still a weapon wielded by humans, and humans are subject to the same weather, the same exhaustion, the same hunger. The Byzantines inside their city endure. The attackers outside begin to fray. Some accounts emphasize the role of storms that damage ships and the difficult conditions that undermine the besieging forces. Others highlight the diplomatic and military pressure from the Bulgars, who attack the besiegers and force them to fight on more than one front. When an army is stretched, it loses the luxury of patience. It begins to bleed in small ways that add up: lost men, lost horses, lost supplies, lost confidence. And still, throughout this long siege, Greek fire remains like an unanswerable question hanging over the sea. Even when it is not actively burning, it shapes decisions. Enemy captains hesitate. Naval commanders keep their distance or attempt strategies meant to avoid close engagement. They adapt. They try. And yet the Byzantines retain an advantage that feels unnatural, not because nature is being broken, but because a secret is being guarded. In a sense, the second siege shows Greek fire at its most mature, not as a surprise, but as a maintained capability. That maturity matters. Surprise weapons often fade once the enemy learns. But Greek fire remained effective because it was embedded in a defensive system, geography, fleet tactics, state secrecy, and a city's stubborn endurance. And the siege ends. The attackers withdraw, unable to maintain the pressure. Constantinople remains standing, scarred, hungry, exhausted, but alive. The empire survives one more turning of the wheel, and when we step back from the story, we can see why historians often mark this as a pivotal moment. If the city had fallen, the trajectory of Byzantine history and the balance of power around the Mediterranean could have shifted dramatically. Yet it is also here that the mystery sharpens. Because if Greek fire helped save the city twice, if it served as a decisive edge in the most existential crisis Byzantium faced, why do we still not know what it was? The answer again is the Byzantines themselves. Success encouraged secrecy. Survival rewarded silence. The more valuable the weapon became, the less likely its details would be written plainly for future eyes. Greek fire is not missing from the record because it was unimportant. It is missing in detail because it was too important to risk. And so the second siege leaves us with two images that sit side by side like firelight and shadow, a city enduring through winter, and a flame that could not be extinguished by water. Together they form the heart of Greek fire's legend, one part human resilience, one part guarded technology. As the waters calm again and the season-turned ships resume their ordinary movement through the Bosporus, trade returns in cautious waves, life reclaims the streets. But beneath the daily routine, the empire remembers what nearly happened and what saved it. A secret weapon kept alive by discipline, a city that would not burn. Cheirosiphons and fire on land. The sea is where Greek fire is most easily imagined, dark water ships clustered like shadows, and a sudden bloom of flame that seems to mock the very idea of waves. But the Byzantines did not live only on the sea. They lived behind walls, inside streets, along frontier roads, in forts that watched valleys and passes. They fought wars of ambush and siege of raids and counter-raids of slow pressure on stone and sudden violence at gates. And if Greek fire truly belonged to the Byzantine state, not merely as a lucky trick, but as a guarded military tradition, then it would never remain confined to the deck of a ship. An empire that understood advantage would ask the obvious question in quieter rooms, long after the smoke of naval battles had drifted away. If we can make fire obey us on water, can we make it obey us on land? You can picture a siege scene at dusk somewhere along the empire's long, uncertain frontier. The sky is bruised purple. The air smells of dust and trampled grass. A fortress stands ahead, stone walls catching the last light towers like clenched fists against the horizon. Outside those walls, an attacking army has built its temporary world tents, cook fires, stacks of timber, the low murmur of thousands of bodies settling into night. Inside the fortress, defenders listen, counting the sounds, hammering, digging the creak of siege engines being assembled. On land, fire has always been a siege weapon. Burning arrows, pitch, oil poured from parapets, clay pots filled with flammable mixtures shattered on impact so that liquid fire spreads in a sudden chaotic puddle. These methods are ancient, older than Byzantium itself. Yet Greek fire was said to be different. Not merely a fire that burns, but a fire that behaves sticky, persistent, difficult to extinguish, and most importantly, deployable in ways that suggest control rather than mere throwing. This is where the word Cheirosiphon enters the story, a hand siphon, a smaller cousin of the ship-mounted projection system. The very existence of the term preserved in Byzantine military tradition hints that the idea of portable flame projection was not only dreamed of, but at least seriously contemplated. Whether Cheirosiphons were widespread battlefield tools or more limited specialized devices is harder to prove. Our sources do not give us the kind of inventory a modern army would leave behind. But they do leave an impression. Greek fire was imagined as adaptable, capable of being carried closer to the human body, closer to walls and gates, closer to the intimate geography of siege fighting. Imagine what such a device would require: a container strong enough to hold a volatile mixture, a tube or nozzle through which the liquid could be projected, a means of pressure, perhaps a pump worked by hand, perhaps bellows, perhaps a piston-like mechanism, an ignition point that could survive wind movement and the chaos of combat. And then, most difficult of all, a user trained to operate it without panic, without mistake, without becoming the first casualty of his own flame. On a ship, the siphon crew could be protected by distance and by the structure of the vessel. On land, a Cheirosiphon operator would be dangerously close to the target. He would be within arrow range, within stone throw range, within the radius of splinters and collapsing wood. He would also be carrying quite literally a disaster in his hands. So if Cheirosiphons were used, they were likely deployed in very specific circumstances, moments when the risk was justified by the potential gain. Defensive situations, for example, where a fortress gate was being battered, where attackers crowded into a narrow space, where the defenders could unleash a short, controlled burst of flame into a dense mass of men and wood. Or offensive situations where a breach had opened and the Byzantines needed to clear a passage quickly, turning a corridor into a furnace so the enemy could not hold it. And if this sounds brutal, it is. But siege warfare is the most intimate form of war between walls. It is slow cruelty punctuated by sudden horror. And in that world, fire is not an embellishment. It is a language of fear. There is another route Greek fire could take onto land containers. Many accounts suggest that Greek fire could be hurled in ceramic vessels, something like grenades. This method is, in a sense, more plausible for broader use. It does not require complex pumps and tubes. It relies on gravity, arm strength, and the fragile nature of clay. A pot filled with incendiary mixture, sealed, carried carefully, then thrown from walls or into siege works. When it shatters, the liquid spreads and ignites, clinging to surfaces, turning wooden structures into torches. If the Byzantine mixture was sticky, rich in resins or thickened oils, then these thrown vessels would be especially effective against siege towers, ladders, rams, and the packed timber of assault platforms. A siege engine is by its nature flammable. It is wood, leather, rope, and pitch. It is built under pressure, often quickly, sometimes imperfectly. It may have wet hides draped over it for protection, but even hides can be overcome by persistent fire and heat. Now imagine being an attacker pushing a siege tower forward. Your hands are on the beams, your feet slip in mud, your mouth tastes like dust. You are sweating under armor, straining, hearing arrows strike the wood above. Then a clay pot bursts on the platform, and suddenly there is smoke heat and a spreading burn that does not behave like ordinary flame. You try to stamp it out. It clings. You try to throw water. It hisses and refuses to die. Panic turns coordinated effort into scattered motion. The tower slows. The defenders above regain control. In such a scenario, Greek fire does not need to be perfect to be useful. It needs only to disrupt, to delay, to turn an assault into a hesitation. In siege warfare, a few minutes can save a wall. Byzantine military writing, especially from later centuries when authors like Leo VI the Wise compiled and preserved tactical knowledge, reflects an empire deeply aware of such practical concerns. Manuals discuss the use of fire, the handling of incendiaries, the importance of preparation and caution. Even when a text is not an eyewitness record of one specific battle, it reveals what the Byzantine military wanted to remember and systematize methods, precautions, doctrines. Greek fire lives in that realm as well, not always as a detailed recipe, but as a recognized tool within a wider repertoire of fire warfare. Yet here again, the mystery tightens rather than loosens, because the more we imagine Greek fire on land, the more questions arise. If Cheirosiphons and firepots existed, how common were they? Were they reserved for elite units? Did they require specialists attached to the imperial court or navy? Were they used primarily in defense where the risk could be managed rather than in open field battles where wind and chaos could turn the weapon against its own side? And perhaps the most revealing question of all, if Greek fire was so feared, why do we not see it everywhere in medieval warfare? The answer may be simple. It was hard. A truly effective Greek fire system would require steady access to ingredients, some possibly imported or difficult to refine. It would require careful storage and transport. It would require trained operators and strict discipline. It would require a state capable of maintaining workshops and protecting knowledge across generations. That is not the condition of most medieval polities for most of the time. But Byzantium, especially in periods when it was stable, could sustain such a tradition precisely because it was administrative, centralized, and paranoid in the way only long-lived states learn to be. On land, those constraints would bite even harder. One gust of wind could ruin everything. One arrow into a storage container could turn a defensive position into an inferno. One frightened operator could drop the device. So perhaps Greek fire on land was less a constant presence and more a rare intervention, a carefully chosen moment when the empire unleashed its secret to change the course of a crisis. In that sense, Greek fire becomes almost like a sacred instrument of war, not used lightly, not displayed casually, but brought out when survival demanded it, when the empire wanted to remind the world that it still possessed something its enemies could not understand. As night falls over the imagined siege scene, the fortress walls glow with torchlight. The attackers' campfires flicker beyond bowshot. Smoke rises into a starless sky. Somewhere behind the fortifications, in a guarded chamber or a sheltered corner of a tower, a small group of men check containers and cloth seals, whispering instructions. Their movements are steady, deliberate. They treat the substance with respect, not because it is magical, but because it is dangerous. Greek fire, whether hurled in clay or projected through a Cheirosiphon, is the same lesson repeated in a different landscape. The Byzantines learned to weaponize not only flame, but knowledge. They learned to keep advantage alive through careful handling, careful secrecy, careful timing. And now, as the mystery spreads from sea battles to siege walls, another question rises, quiet, persistent, almost inevitable. If Greek fire could be used beyond the sea, if it could be carried in pots and pipes and hands, then what kind of state secrecy could possibly keep such a thing from being copied? A state secret kept like a relic. There are secrets you keep because they are embarrassing, and there are secrets you keep because they are precious. But the most enduring secrets, the ones that last longer than the people who first spoke them, are kept because they are necessary. Greek fire was that kind of secret, not a private curiosity, not a clever trick, a necessity bound to the survival of a state. Imagine Constantinople at night, long after the day's noise has faded. The city streets are quieter now, the stones cooling under a thin wind that smells of salt and distant hearth smoke. In the harbors, ships rock gently against their moorings, their rigging clicking softly like small bones. From the walls, watchfires glow in steady points along the dark line of defense. The empire looks peaceful from a distance, but peace here is only a surface film. Beneath it lies the constant awareness that the world is watching, waiting, measuring weakness. Somewhere inside this immense city machine, behind doors that do not stand out from the others, there is a workshop that does not advertise itself. Its windows are small if they exist at all. Its guards are not loud. They do not swagger because swagger invites attention. They simply stand steady as stone, turning away the curious with the calm certainty of men who do not need to explain themselves. Inside, the air is different. It is heavy with odors that cling to fabric, oily sharpness, resin, sweetness, the bitter edge of sulfurous smoke that lingers even when nothing is burning. Containers line a wall sealed, labeled in codes that mean little to outsiders. Tools are laid out with care. A brazier or protected flame might glow low not for warmth but for controlled ignition tests. The men working here speak quietly as if sound itself might travel farther than it should. This is the kind of atmosphere in which Greek fire becomes more than chemistry. It becomes policy. Byzantium was not merely a battlefield society. It was a civilization of paperwork and ceremony, of ranks and protocols, of carefully layered authority. That nature, the empire's administrative mind, was perfectly suited to guarding a military secret, because secrecy at this scale is not achieved by one person being clever. It is achieved by a system. And systems keep secrets by doing something very simple. They prevent any one person from knowing everything. Compartmentalization, though the word is modern, fits what the Byzantines appear to have practiced. The ingredients might be sourced by one group, refined by another, mixed by a third, transported by a fourth, deployed by a fifth. A sailor might know how to operate the siphon, how to read the wind, how to maintain the nozzle, and keep the ignition steady, but not the recipe. A workshop laborer might know how to heat and blend certain components, but not where they were going or how they would be projected. A quartermaster might know which seals meant danger and which storerooms required special handling, but not what was inside. In a world where paper could be stolen, where prisoners could be interrogated, where rival states paid for information in gold and favors, this kind of design is a fortress of its own. Greek fire was also guarded tradition, tells us, by proximity to the highest power. Later accounts and the aura of legend suggest the secret was bound to the emperor and a small circle, perhaps certain families, certain trusted specialists, people whose loyalty could be ensured by privilege and fear, whose survival depended on the state that protected them. This is how a secret becomes hereditary, not necessarily written down, but passed. Like a craft, like a ritual, like a prayer whispered from parent to child, from master to apprentice, with rules about when it may be spoken and to whom. In such a tradition, the loss of a single person does not destroy the knowledge. The knowledge lives in the chain. But secrecy is not only about controlling information, it is also about controlling materials. Even the most brilliant recipe is useless if the ingredients are inconsistent. If Greek fire involved petroleum-like substances, they would have to be sourced perhaps from natural seeps, perhaps through trade networks, perhaps from regions beyond the immediate heartland. If it involved sulfur or resin, those two required supply and refinement. If quicklime played a role, It demanded controlled production. Each of these components would have a smell, a texture, a behavior under heat that skilled handlers would learn to recognize. The Byzantines' experienced administrators would have understood this. A state monopoly is not only secrecy of method, it is monopoly of access. The empire could restrict trade in certain materials, monitor shipments, regulate who could handle them. It could keep workshops within guarded zones attached to the Navy's shipyards or the capital's arsenals. It could punish leakage. It could reward silence. And the punishment mattered. We should not romanticize Byzantine secrecy as polite discretion. Medieval states enforced control through harsh means when they felt threatened. If Greek fire was truly as decisive as tradition suggests, then revealing its production methods could be treated as treason, a betrayal not merely of an emperor, but of the city's survival. Fear in this setting is not melodrama. It is an administrative tool. Yet fear alone does not create loyalty. Byzantium also understood incentives. Specialists who held dangerous knowledge might be rewarded with status exemptions or protection. They might be housed well-fed, well-integrated into the imperial orbit, so they had more to lose than to gain by betrayal. A secret is safest when the people holding it feel their best future is inside the system, not outside it. So Greek fire becomes, in a sense, a mirror of the empire itself, centralized, guarded, layered, maintained through both pressure and privilege. But the greatest proof of this secrecy is not that Greek fire existed, it is that others could not easily replicate it. Enemies saw the flames. They watched ships burn. They heard the stories from survivors. They may have captured equipment or residue. And yet for centuries no rival produced an equivalent that overturned Byzantine advantage in the same way. That does not mean no one tried. It means that trying was not enough, because copying is not a single act. It is a long process of trial failure, refinement, and sustained institutional memory. To copy Greek fire, a rival would need repeated access to the substance, repeated testing under real conditions, and a stable system to keep developing it. Many medieval powers were strong in bursts, brilliant campaigns, sudden expansions, but lacked the long bureaucratic continuity Byzantium excelled at. Some had naval traditions, yes, but not necessarily the centralized state infrastructure that could guard and preserve a volatile technology for generations. In other words, Greek fire was not only a secret weapon, it was a weapon that required a secret state. And still, even for Byzantium, secrecy had a cost. The more a technology is confined to a narrow circle, the more fragile it becomes. If only a few people know the full process, then illness, accident, political upheaval, any disruption can snap the chain. A guarded tradition can endure for centuries and then vanish abruptly, not with a dramatic theft, but with a quiet failure of transmission. That tension, the tension between protection and fragility, is one of the most human aspects of the Greek fire mystery. The empire hid the knowledge so well that it survived enemies. But that same secrecy may have made it vulnerable to time. And time is a different kind of conqueror. You can almost feel the paradox in the city's nighttime air. The watchfires on the wall burn steadily, yet each one will eventually be extinguished. The empire's ceremonies repeat, yet each generation is new and uncertain. Greek fire, carefully guarded like a relic, burns brightest in moments of crisis, but the system that keeps it alive must function even when no one wants to think about crisis. In the end, Greek fire's secrecy is not just a detail of espionage. It is a central theme how Byzantium survived by turning knowledge into a wall, an invisible fortification, built not of stone, but of controlled access, disciplined training, and silence maintained under pressure. And now, as we stand at the edge of this guarded world, a natural question rises quietly, insistently, like a candle flame you cannot ignore. If the Byzantines kept the secret so carefully, what happened when enemies tried to steal it anyway? Enemies, imitations, and the limits of theft. In every age of war, there is a certain kind of hunger that follows power. Not hunger for food, but hunger for understanding. When a weapon changes the balance, when it turns confidence into panic, its enemies do not only fear it, they want to take it apart in their minds. They want to know what it is made of, how it works, how it can be neutralized. They want to make it theirs. Greek fire, once revealed on the waters outside Constantinople, would have awakened that hunger immediately. Imagine an enemy camp after a failed naval engagement. The day's chaos has quieted, but the smell remains scorched, wood, oily, smoke-damp fabric. Survivors sit close to small fires, their faces lit from below eyes, bright with exhaustion. Some are wounded, some stare into nothing, still hearing the roar in their heads. Officers move among them, asking questions with careful patience. Where did the flame come from? How far did it reach? What happened when water was thrown? What did the Byzantines do before firing? Men answer in fragments. The story is repeated, compared, corrected. A map is drawn in the dirt. Someone tries to name the weapon, but names are slippery when fear is still fresh. And somewhere beyond the camp on the dark sea, charred planks drift like evidence no one can properly read. The obvious assumption is that the secret could be stolen. After all, ships are captured in war. Equipment changes hands. Prisoners are taken. Coastal raids and counter-raids seize supplies. If Greek fire was stored in containers, if siphons were mounted on ships, surely at some point an enemy would seize something tangible, a vessel, a device, a residue of the substance itself. And indeed, traditions and hints suggest that rivals did sometimes capture Greek fire or elements associated with it. Yet the most striking thing about the historical record is what does not happen. We do not see Greek fire become a widely replicated technology that spreads across the Mediterranean in the same decisive form. We do not see enemies suddenly matching Byzantium ship for ship with comparable flamethrowers that burn on water. Instead, we see the secret remain stubbornly Byzantine. So why did theft fail? To answer that, we have to understand how copying works in a pre-modern world. In modern times, we imagine reverse engineering as a matter of dismantling an object and analyzing its components. But medieval societies lacked modern chemistry, lacked standardized measurements, lacked industrial consistency. Even if you held a sample, you might not be able to isolate its ingredients with certainty. You could guess, and guessing can be dangerous when the mixture is volatile. More importantly, Greek fire was likely not a single ingredient that could be recognized by sight. It was probably a mixture, perhaps petroleum-based liquids combined with resin sulfur and other additives that altered viscosity, ignition, smoke, and adhesion. Each component could vary by source and purity. Even if an enemy recognized one element, an oily smell, suggesting naphtha, for example, they would still have to know proportions, preparation, storage conditions, and ignition methods. And then there is the mechanism. Capturing a siphon apparatus might give you a clue to projection, metal tubes, valves, pumping components. But without the proper mixture, the device might be useless. Or worse, it might work unpredictably and kill its own operators. A flamethrower-like system is unforgiving. If pressure is wrong, the stream sputters or explodes. If ignition is unstable, the flame burns backward. If seals fail, the liquid leaks into the ship. A working weapon requires not just parts, but reliable manufacturing and repeated training. This is where the Byzantines may have been especially hard to imitate. They were by medieval standards unusually bureaucratic and technically organized. They had state workshops, naval infrastructure, and institutional continuity. They could maintain and refine devices over decades. Rivals might have strong fleets, but did they have the same sustained system for producing, maintaining, and training with such dangerous technology? Sometimes yes in certain periods, but often no or not at the right moment. So theft in this setting runs into a wall, the wall of systemic complexity. There is also the human factor secrecy, enforced not only by hiding information, but by ensuring that those who knew it did not survive capture easily or did not know enough to betray it, even if captured. If knowledge was compartmentalized, then a captured operator might only know how to pump and aim, not how to make the mixture. A captured workshop laborer might know only a part of the preparation, not the whole recipe. A captured sailor might have seen the effect, but never handled the substance itself. In such a world, the enemy can seize fragments, but fragments do not build a tradition. And yet, enemies did not stop trying. They experimented with their own incendiaries. They used fire pots. They used tar and oil. They developed siege techniques involving flame. They learned to fear the Byzantine Siphons and to adapt their tactics, keeping distance, maneuvering differently, attempting to strike from angles where wind might protect them. They sought countermeasures, sand, earth, wet hides, perhaps acidic mixtures like vinegar, in attempts to smother or cool burning substances. Some of these measures might have helped in specific situations, especially if Greek fire could be deprived of oxygen or if its burning fuel could be dispersed. But countermeasures are not the same as replication. Learning how to survive a weapon is different from learning how to produce it. Replication requires repeated controlled experimentation. It requires safe testing grounds. It requires resources to waste on failure. It requires record-keeping and instruction so that each generation does not start from scratch. In the medieval world where crises could interrupt everything, where courts moved, cities fell, supply lines broke, and trained specialists died in war, such sustained experimentation was rare. It did happen, but not always in the way modern minds assume. In this light, Greek fire's endurance begins to look less mysterious. The Byzantines had the continuity and the incentive to preserve a dangerous craft. Their enemies had every incentive to steal it, but not always the continuity to refine it into a reliable system. There is also another subtle point. Greek fire may have depended on supply chains that were easier for Byzantium to maintain than for its rivals. If key ingredients came through Byzantine-controlled trade networks or from regions accessible to the empire, then even knowing the recipe would not guarantee consistent production. A formula without access is like a map without roads. And then, inevitably, there is the distortive fog of legend. Some medieval stories insist enemies captured Greek fire, but could not use it. Others suggest that captured samples lost their potency or behaved unpredictably. These claims may reflect real difficulties. Volatile compounds degrade sealed containers, fail mixtures, separate certain ignition conditions are required. Or they may reflect the Byzantines' desire to emphasize the weapon's uniqueness, to frame it as something almost divinely protected, untouchable by outsiders. But even if the rhetoric is embellished, the underlying truth remains Greek fire as a state secret resisted theft in a way that many other technologies did not. That resistance turns the story toward a different kind of mystery, the mystery of fragility. Because if Greek fire could not be stolen easily, if it required a protected tradition, then it was powerful, but also dependent. It needed the Byzantine state to remain stable enough to keep workshops running, to keep specialists trained, to keep supplies flowing, to keep secrecy intact. And states are not permanent, no matter how eternal they appear. So Part 11 ends with a quiet realization. Greek fire is often remembered as an unstoppable flame, a weapon that enemies could not extinguish. But perhaps its most remarkable feature was not its burning. It was its containment, the way Byzantium managed to keep the weapon inside its own hands generation after generation, despite war espionage and the constant human urge to imitate. A secret held tight. And now, with the limits of theft made clear, we move toward the question that has haunted historians and chemists alike. If we cannot steal the answer from the past, can we reason our way toward it in the present? The formula, what might it have been? If you walk along certain shores of the ancient world, there are places where the earth itself seems to exhale. Dark liquids seep from stone. Oily films spread across puddles. The smell is sharp, mineral bitter, unmistakably flammable. Long before modern industry people noticed these gifts and dangers, bitumen for sealing boats, pitch for waterproofing, oils for lamps. In quiet corners of the Mediterranean and Near East, fire did not always begin with wood. Sometimes it began with the ground. It is in that older earth-born fire that the most grounded theories of Greek fire usually begin, because Greek fire, for all its legend, behaves in ways that point toward real materials, not supernatural ones, materials that float, cling smoke, and burn with stubborn intensity, materials that would have been known, at least in part, to craftsmen, sailors, and engineers who lived in a world where ships were sealed with resin and ropes were soaked in tar. Still, we should begin with the most honest admission: we do not have the formula. We do not have a preserved sample. We do not have a Byzantine recipe page hidden in a monastery archive with proportions neatly written. What we have are descriptions of effects, hints about deployment, and the knowledge of chemistry and materials that allows us to ask what combination could produce what witnesses claim to have seen. The key behaviors to explain are familiar by now, like footprints in wet sand. Greek fire was described as a liquid flame projected from siphons or thrown in containers. It produced thick smoke and fearsome heat. It clung to surfaces, and most famously, it was said to burn on water and resist ordinary attempts to extinguish it. So if we strip away the poetry and keep the physics, what might fit? The most common starting point is a petroleum-based fuel, something like crude oil naphtha, or related naturally occurring hydrocarbons. Such liquids are flammable, they can float on water, and when they burn, they produce heavy, dark smoke. If a burning petroleum film spreads on the surface, it creates exactly the nightmare that chroniclers struggle to describe fire that seems to live on water. Not because it feeds on water, but because water cannot sink it. This alone could already explain part of the legend. But petroleum by itself can be too thin, too eager to run off surfaces, too quick to disperse. Greek fire was also remembered as sticky, clinging to hulls and skin. That suggests thickening agents, resins, pitch tar, or other substances that increase viscosity. Pine resin, for example, was widely used in the ancient and medieval Mediterranean. It is adhesive, it burns, and when heated and mixed, it can create a substance that behaves less like a spilled liquid and more like a clinging smear. Combine a petroleum-like base with resinous thickeners, and you begin to approach a fuel that splatters sticks and keeps burning where it lands. Then there is sulfur, another frequent candidate. Sulfur burns with an intense, choking character and can contribute to a smoke that irritates eyes and lungs. It is also historically plausible as a component in incendiary mixtures known and used long before the medieval period. If Greek fire contained sulfur, it could help explain the suffocating quality of the smoke described by witnesses and the sense that the weapon did more than ignite wood. It attacked the body's ability to breathe and see, turning decks into confusion. Add to this the possibility of bitumen or asphalt-like materials, sticky dark substances used in waterproofing and construction. These burn, they cling, and they produce thick smoke. They could also help stabilize a mixture during storage and transport, reducing separation and making the fuel more consistent. So far, the picture that emerges is not a single magical ingredient, but a family of plausible ones. A floating fuel, petroleum or related oils, thickeners, resin, pitch, bitumen, and additives that shape smoke and heat sulfur. Perhaps other mineral components. This combination would be terrifying enough, and it would fit many accounts without requiring anything impossible. But there is one more feature that keeps pulling the imagination: the claim that Greek fire could ignite or reignite under certain conditions, and that water was useless against it. Here we approach the more controversial hypothesis: quicklime. Quicklime, when it contacts water, undergoes a reaction that releases heat. In the right circumstances, that heat can be intense. The idea that quicklime might have been included in Greek fire is appealing because it offers an almost theatrical twist, a substance that becomes hotter when you throw water on it. That fits the psychological shock described by chroniclers, the moment when instinctive firefighting fails. But chemistry is fussy, and history is fussy too. Even if quicklime produces heat upon contact with water, turning that reaction into a reliable battlefield ignition system is not straightforward. The quicklime would need to be protected from moisture before use. It would need to contact water in a way that releases enough heat in the right place at the right time to ignite flammable components. It would need to be mixed and stored without accidentally reacting inside the container. It is possible in principle, but it increases the complexity and the risk. And complexity is both a point in its favor and a point against it. In favor because Greek fire seems to have been difficult to copy, suggesting either unusual ingredients, unusual preparation, or both. Against because the more complex the mixture, the harder it is to deploy safely and consistently across decades. Yet Byzantium was capable of sustaining complexity when it mattered, especially if the weapon was used by specialists under controlled conditions. So quicklime remains a plausible component, particularly for explaining why water sometimes failed spectacularly, but not a settled answer. There are also theories involving other reactive substances or preparation methods, fuels heated, before projection pressurized delivery, creating a spray that ignites more easily, and ignition systems at the nozzle that make the stream appear like living flame. In that view, the magic is not in a self-igniting mixture, but in the system, a hot atomized fuel stream meeting a controlled ignition point, producing an effect so sudden and forceful that witnesses describe it as unnatural. And that, again, may be the most Byzantine solution of all, not one miracle ingredient, but a well-engineered marriage of materials and device. Still, even with a plausible basket of ingredients, we confront the same quiet barrier: we cannot prove it. The Byzantines protected the method, and time protected their protection. What survives are words, and words are imperfect measuring tools. Some chroniclers wrote long after the events they describe. Some relied on earlier texts, now lost. Some used rhetorical language meant to convey awe or divine favor rather than chemical detail. A phrase like burned on water might be literal, or it might be a compressed way of saying water did not extinguish it. A description of unquenchable fire might capture emotional truth more than technical precision, and a weapon used during chaos will always be remembered more vividly than it is understood. This is why Greek fire remains, even in scientific discussion, a kind of disciplined humility lesson. The past does not always surrender its mechanisms. We can build strong hypotheses. We can test reconstructions in controlled settings. We can compare behaviors of known materials. But without an authenticated sample and clear documentation, certainty stays just out of reach, like shoreline lights seen across water in mist. And perhaps that is fitting. Greek fire was a weapon of controlled knowledge. It depended on limiting what others could know. It made secrecy into strategy. So the fact that we modern listeners and readers cannot pin down the exact recipe may not be an accident of history. It may be the final echo of Byzantine policy still working across the centuries. In the quiet after all these theories, one image remains steady, a mixture likely oil-based, thickened, smoky, terrifying, kept in guarded containers, handled by trained hands, projected through siphons with careful attention to wind and distance. The Byzantines did not need the world to understand it. They needed the world to fear it. And the world did. Why the secret was lost? There is a quiet tragedy in the way complex skills disappear. Not with an explosion, not with a final dramatic declaration, but with a series of small interruptions, missed lessons, broken routines, workshops that fall silent. One generation assumes the next will carry it. The next generation is busy surviving. And then one day what once seemed permanent is simply gone. You can sense this fragility in the very way Greek fire survives in our sources, vivid in effect, elusive in method. A weapon that was guarded for centuries, yet left behind no clear recipe. A flame that lit up the sea, yet vanished like breath in winter. To understand why Greek fire was lost, we have to stop thinking of it as a single object, like a sword that can be inherited or stolen, and start thinking of it as a living tradition. It required materials, preparation, storage, specialized devices, trained crews, and above all, a state capable of sustaining the entire chain. Greek fire was not just chemistry, it was organization, and organization in the long run is always vulnerable. Imagine a Byzantine workshop at the height of the empire's competence. The city outside hums with trade and ceremony. The navy is funded, the docks are busy. The imperial administration still functions like a well-used instrument. In a guarded area near shipyards or arsenals, specialists prepare and maintain the weapon. The work is dangerous, so it is concentrated in skilled hands. There are procedures how to seal containers, how to test viscosity, how to prepare ignition, how to maintain valves and nozzles, how to transport the mixture without disaster. These procedures may not be written down fully, perhaps deliberately, but they are taught. In such a world, Greek fire can endure. But now imagine that same workshop in a later century, when the empire's pulse is less steady. The Mediterranean changes, trade routes shift, rival powers rise and fall. Wars come not as single storms, but as a weather pattern, too frequent, too draining, too disruptive to allow a long recovery. The empire loses territory in waves and then regains some, only to lose again. Court politics destabilize priorities. Funding is redirected. Shipyards decay. Skilled workers are lost to war, famine, or migration. A workshop that once had stable access to ingredients now has to negotiate scarcity. A secret craft cannot thrive in permanent instability. In the centuries after Greek fire's first appearances, the Byzantine Empire endured remarkable revivals, periods of reorganization, expansion, cultural flowering. But it also endured repeated shocks, civil wars, invasions, economic contractions, and the slow fracturing of its ability to command resources on the scale it once did. Each shock would have stressed the delicate chain that kept Greek fire viable. And the chain has many weak links. Consider ingredients alone. If Greek fire depended on petroleum-like substances, those had to be sourced reliably. If it depended on resin, sulfur, or other materials, those too required access and refinement. A city under siege cannot easily import specialized components. A province lost to an enemy can cut off supply. A trade disruption can change quality and availability. Even if the recipe is remembered, a shortage forces substitutions, and substitutions in a volatile mixture can mean failure or catastrophe. Then consider the devices. Siphons and pressure systems require metalworking maintenance and skilled fabrication. They require replacement parts. They require consistent standards. If a nozzle cracks, if a valve fails, if seals degrade, the weapon becomes unusable or worse, lethal to the operator. Maintaining such systems over centuries requires workshops funding and specialists who are not constantly being reassigned or killed. Then consider training. A weapon like Greek fire is not something you hand to an untrained soldier in a moment of panic. It requires discipline, especially in naval contexts where wind and motion can turn advantage into self-destruction. It requires a culture of expertise crews who know when to fire, how to adjust, how to retreat, how to prevent their own ship from becoming a torch. If the empire's navy declines, if fleets shrink, if experienced seamen are lost, then even a preserved supply of Greek fire would be far less effective. And now we reach the most subtle and perhaps most important factor: secrecy itself. Greek fire was guarded through compartmentalization, restricted circles, and likely oral transmission. That secrecy helped preserve the advantage against enemies, but it also meant the knowledge lived in fewer minds. Fewer minds means fewer chances for redundancy. In a stable system, that might be manageable. In an unstable system, it becomes dangerous. A craft preserved in a narrow lineage can be broken by accidents of history. A single workshop burned a single family line, interrupted a single political purge, a single disease outbreak. In Byzantium's long, often violent history, there were more than enough opportunities for such disruptions. Think of the empire's later centuries, when internal crises became more frequent. Civil wars can be especially corrosive to specialized knowledge because they target institutions from within. A rival faction might seize arsenals, dismantle workshops, exile specialists, or divert funds away from the Navy to pay land troops. Skilled people might flee to protect their families. In a civil war, even the state becomes multiple competing states, each suspicious of the other. And in that environment, a secret weapon program can simply wither, not because anyone chooses to abandon it, but because it becomes too expensive, too risky, too difficult to sustain. There is also the possibility of technological and tactical shift. Greek fire was most famously effective in the context of wooden ships' close engagements and specific naval conditions. Over time, warfare evolves. Tactics change. New siege techniques emerge. Political priorities shift toward different frontiers. Even if Greek fire remained known, it might be used less often, reserved for rare emergencies. And a tool used rarely is a tool whose supporting traditions fade. Skills rust. Procedures are forgotten. Ingredients go out of habitual supply. A workshop that is not actively funded becomes a storage room, then a ruin. The loss of Greek fire then may not be a single event at all. It may be a slow dimming. And finally, the empire itself declines toward its last great catastrophe. By the later medieval period, Byzantium is no longer the commanding power of the Eastern Mediterranean. Its resources are constrained. Its territory is fragmented. Its politics are strained by external pressure and internal faction. When Constantinople finally falls in 1453, it is the end not only of a city-state, but of an institutional memory stretching back 1,000 years. If Greek fire was still known in any practical sense by then, and that itself is uncertain, its survival would have depended on the continued existence of the institutions that guarded it. Once those institutions collapse, secrecy becomes meaningless. A secret is only a secret when there is a community committed to keeping it a structure that rewards silence and punishes betrayal. When the structure dies, the secret can die with it, especially if it was never fully written down. This is the paradox of Greek fire's legacy. The Byzantines protected it so well that it outlived their enemies' ability to copy it, yet that same protection may have left it vulnerable to the empire's own decline. The weapon was not lost because a rival finally stole it. It was lost because the world that could sustain it, economically, administratively, culturally, was slowly dismantled. And perhaps this is why Greek fire remains so haunting as a historical mystery. It is not only the story of a weapon that burned ships. It is the story of how knowledge can be both a shield and a cage, how an advantage can be kept alive by narrowing it and lost by narrowing it too far, how the most powerful tools are sometimes the most fragile because they depend on uninterrupted human continuity. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the quiet end of such a tradition, a workshop door that no longer opens a set of tools left unused, a sealed container that is never refilled, a master craftsman dying without a final apprentice. No dramatic betrayal, only the ordinary silence of time. The last flame and the long echo. The Bosporus is quiet again, not silent, never truly silent, but quiet in the way ancient waterways become quiet when you stop asking them to perform history for you. The water moves with the same patient force it always has, carrying small boats and great ships alike, turning sunlight into broken pieces, swallowing sound and returning it as distant echoes. Along the shore, the city that was once Constantinople, once the guarded heart of an empire, still rises in stone and silhouette, different flags, different languages in the streets, different centuries layered like sediment. And yet the geography remains the narrow strait, the sheltered horn, the meeting point of worlds. It is here in this unchanged stage that Greek fire feels most haunting because it belongs so perfectly to this place and because it is now gone. You can almost imagine it if you let your mind drift slowly enough, a Byzantine dromon easing out of the Golden Horn under a low sky oars, dipping in unison the smell of tar and salt rising from the deck. The ship's prow cuts a clean line through the water. On the bow beneath the protective housing, a siphon waits metal, darkened by use, handled only by men trained to respect it. Somewhere below sealed containers sit in shadow. The crew's movements are calm, precise, practiced. The sea is not an empty space to them. It is a corridor, a defense, a boundary that can be turned into a weapon. And then, in another breath of imagination, the scene dissolves. No one can bring the flame back in the way it once existed. No laboratory can unlock the exact proportions with certainty. No museum can display a bottle labeled Greek fire and guarantee its truth. The weapon lives now in the space between knowledge and absence, the kind of space where mysteries grow quiet roots. And still, its echo is real. Greek fire's first legacy is the simplest one it helped Byzantium survive. Not alone, not as a single magic solution, but as an advantage embedded in a larger defensive system. The empire endured centuries longer than many believed it should, maintaining a capital that held firm through sieges and storms. Greek fire likely contributed to that endurance by shaping naval warfare around Constantinople, by breaking blockades, disrupting enemy fleets, and turning fear into deterrence. It helped keep the sea from becoming a noose. That survival had consequences far beyond one city's walls. Byzantium was not merely a political entity, it was a bridge of transmission. It preserved and copied texts, it carried legal traditions forward, it maintained Christian institutions that influenced Europe, the Balkans, and the wider Mediterranean. It served as a buffer zone and a diplomatic force, sometimes restraining waves of expansion, sometimes absorbing them, sometimes redirecting them. To say Greek fire saved Western civilization is too sweeping and too clean. History rarely obeys such slogans. But it is reasonable to say this: any tool that helped keep Constantinople standing changed the tempo of regional history, delaying certain outcomes and allowing others to unfold. The second legacy is more subtle. Greek fire reshaped the psychology of war. Weapons do not only kill, they teach people what to fear. Greek fire taught sailors that water could not always protect them. It taught commanders that an enemy's advantage might be hidden behind silence. It taught rival states that some technologies are not merely inventions, they are institutions. In that sense, Greek fire belongs to a long line of asymmetric advantages, tools that make smaller forces dangerous by making outcomes unpredictable. It is not just the burning that mattered, it is the uncertainty. And uncertainty, once introduced, tends to outlive the weapon itself. The third legacy is the one we live with most directly today: the mystery. Modern historians approach Greek fire with a careful discipline. They treat the chronicles as meaningful but imperfect. They compare accounts across time, noting how descriptions change and where they repeat. They examine Byzantine military manuals and tactical writings for what they suggest about deployment and doctrine. They consider the material culture of the era, ship construction, metalworking, pump technology, the availability of fuels and resins. They test plausible reconstructions in controlled conditions, not to claim certainty, but to explore what behaviors are physically possible. In that investigative work, Greek fire becomes an invitation to humility. It reminds us that the past is not a transparent museum case. It is a landscape of partial evidence. Many of its most important crafts were transmitted orally, guarded politically, and lost quietly. We can reason, infer, simulate, but we cannot always confirm. And yet the very act of trying tells us something about ourselves. Greek fire fascinates modern minds because it sits at the intersection of categories that rarely meet so cleanly: science and myth chemistry and empire technology and secrecy. It is not merely an ancient, cool weapon. It is a lesson in how knowledge can be monopolized, protected, weaponized, and then erased by collapse. It is a reminder that advanced capability does not always leave behind a neat paper trail. Sometimes the most effective systems are the least documented, precisely because documentation is a risk. There is also a cultural legacy, one that lives in imagination rather than archives. Greek fire has inspired novels, games, films, and fantasy worlds. It appears as wildfire in modern fiction, that eerie green flame that clings and consumes, echoing the medieval idea of an unstoppable incendiary. It appears whenever storytellers want a weapon that feels both historical and uncanny, something that could exist, but that remains just beyond full explanation. Greek fire is perfect for that role, because it truly was feared, truly was guarded, and truly is lost. The narrative does not need to exaggerate much. The historical silhouette is already dramatic, but the most beautiful echo of Greek fire is not in fantasy. It is in the quiet reality that Byzantium so often imagined as merely ceremonial, decadent, or doomed, was also practical, adaptive, and technically capable. Greek fire reminds us that the medieval world was not a blank space between antiquity and modernity. It was full of experiments, workshops, systems of expertise, and hard-won knowledge. The Byzantines did not survive by prayer alone. They survived through administration, diplomacy, logistics, and the disciplined cultivation of advantage. And still we end where we began, with a flame on water and a secret that refuses to be fully named. Why does the mystery endure so stubbornly? Because it was designed to endure. Greek fire was protected not by accident, but by policy. The Byzantines treated it like a relic, something to be guarded with reverence and fear. They knew that if the recipe spread, the advantage would evaporate. So they built an invisible wall around it, restricted workshops, trained crews, compartmentalized knowledge, and the quiet enforcement of silence. That wall held perhaps too well. When the empire's institutions weakened, the secret did not migrate easily into the wider world. It did not become common knowledge that could survive the fall of a state. It disappeared with the chain that carried it. There is something almost tender about that in a bleak way. A civilization held on for centuries by concentrating its knowledge, and in the end, that knowledge slipped away like a lamp extinguished in wind. So let the final image be gentle. Night on the Bosporus again. The water is dark, the air cool, the city light softened by distance. Somewhere far off, the call of a bird fades into the wind. You can imagine ships passing, modern ships now loud and bright, yet the water does not care what era it carries. It remembers everything and explains nothing. Greek fire remains a story of survival, secrecy, and the limits of what history allows us to know. It is a reminder that some of the past's most powerful forces are not only the ones we can measure and define, but the ones we can only trace by their echoes, by burned wood in chronicles, by fear in witness accounts, by a long, stubborn fascination that refuses to go out.